Setting: hospital room. Helen waking up groggy from a stroke. Family argument unfolds. She's silent, frozen, and slowly realizing she's being written off. Ends with emotional cliffhanger. The ceiling above her was the color of old dishwater. Dim fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly blue hue across the room. Something in Helen's chest ticked in panic before her brain could catch up. Her body was heavy, not tired heavy, but foreign. She tried to move her fingers. Nothing. Her eyes shifted slightly. That worked. She wasn't home. She was in a hospital. Her mouth tasted like metal and gauze. There was a soft beeping somewhere to her left. An IV line trailed from her arm. Panic clawed through her ribs like a trapped bird. Then she heard them. "So whose name goes on the deed first? Because I don't want to get into some probate mess down the line," said Melissa. "You can't be serious right now." Ryan's voice was sharp, brittle. "She just had a stroke." "Exactly. Which means this isn't some far-off concern anymore." Helen wanted to scream, to sit up and tell them both to shut the hell up. Her brain felt split in two, one half firing in fury, the other muffled like it was underwater. Her mouth wouldn't open, her arms wouldn't move, her legs were gone. She could feel nothing below her neck but panic. She lay there, motionless. "They haven't even said what her prognosis is yet," Ryan continued. "We don't know if this is permanent." Melissa scoffed. "Be realistic." "Did you see her? She couldn't even blink when the nurse asked." "You think she's bouncing back next week? Writing checks and mowing the lawn?" Silence fell like a sheet of glass. A moment later, Helen felt the warmth of another hand slip into hers. Small, careful. Grace. Her granddaughter, the only one not talking. Grace leaned close and whispered just loud enough for Helen to hear. "I'm here, Grandma, I see you." Helen's eyes burned with tears she couldn't shed. She blinked, once, slowly. Grace saw. Her grip tightened. Melissa's heels clicked sharply against the floor. "Listen, I'm not trying to be cold, but if we don't start planning now, everything's gonna fall apart. The house, the accounts." "She's not even gone yet," Ryan snapped. "Christ, Melissa." "She won't be able to live alone anymore," Melissa barked. "What? You want to shuttle her back to that old place and just hope she doesn't fall again? She needs round-the-clock care, a medical plan, maybe a conservatorship." Helen's heart seized. The words swirled and slammed like ice water. She won't be able to live alone anymore. That was it. That was the decision. Made without her. They'd already buried her independence. Signed it away in their minds. Her voice was gone. So they were going to erase it like she never had one. Ryan was pacing now. "We need to slow the hell down. Let the doctors run their tests. Give her a chance." "She's had her chance," Melissa muttered. Helen's vision tunneled. It wasn't just the stroke. It was rage, pure and quiet and blinding. If her body worked, she would have flipped the tray table, dragged herself to the door, thrown them out. But she was locked in. Trapped inside herself. Helpless. And for the first time in her 74 years, she understood what that really meant. A beeping sound changed, faster, sharper. Grace flinched and looked up at the monitor. "I think she's awake," she said. Melissa turned. "Is she moving?" "No," Grace whispered. "But she's here." Helen stared at her granddaughter with every ounce of strength she had left. Grace was watching her back. Yes. But the others? No. They weren't just preparing for her to die, they were already dividing the remains. And they had no idea what kind of fire they were waking. The humming of the fluorescent lights was a dull constant, like the bass line to a slow, simmering rage. Helen lay still in the narrow hospital bed, eyes open now, seeing clearly. Not just what was in front of her. The dull ceiling tiles, the beige privacy curtain half pulled. But what was behind her? Circling. 2 days had passed since her stroke. Her ability to move hadn't returned. Not fully. But she could blink. She could twitch her fingers, just barely. And she could listen. God, could she listen? She'd started cataloging the sounds of betrayal, clicking heels, Melissa, heavy sighs and the jangle of keys, Ryan, whispered pity from nurses, the low static of daytime TV. But it was last night's conversation that sharpened everything. Grace had left her phone on the edge of the tray table while pretending to scroll. It had been recording. Helen hadn't known at first. Not until she saw Grace lean back against the wall outside the room, phone still face down, and heard Melissa's voice carry through the half-closed door. I swear, if I hear one more miracle recovery story, I'm going to scream. Mom's done. I don't care what that neurologist says. Ryan, could you at least pretend you're not auditioning to be the Wicked Witch of probate court? Then Melissa, flat. She's barely functional. You saw her try to move that straw. This is a waiting game. I'm just preparing. Helen felt it like a slap. Not just the cruelty, the certainty. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a countdown. Grace played the audio back for her the next morning, holding the phone just near Helen's ear while the nurse changed an IV bag behind them. Helen blinked. Once. Slowly. I've been recording them whenever they don't know I'm nearby, Grace whispered, brushing a strand of hair behind Helen's ear. I don't know why. I know something's off. Helen wanted to squeeze her hand, to say, don't stop. Later that day, she tried speaking for the first time since the stroke. It came out as a rasp. Almost nothing. But the nurse leaned down and caught it. Copy, report. Do you want a copy of your improvement summary? The nurse asked, gently. Helen blinked twice. Yes. Her pulse pounded. The nurse nodded, taking it in stride. I'll print them from the nurse's station. You're doing better than most do this early, you know. That night, Helen was moved to a rehab facility 2 towns over. Her new roommate was a woman named Janet. Wiry, white-haired, sharp-tongued. Janet watched Helen try to work the speech board one-handed. Eyes narrowed behind thick bifocals. You're not nearly as screwed as they think, she said finally, voice gravelly with age and bourbon. You're sharper than they know. Use it. Helen tilted her head, barely, in acknowledgement. You got family trouble? Janet asked. Helen blinked twice. Janet chuckled. Yeah. You look like the type who married someone for love and raised kids who married people for security. Never ends well. A day later, the improvement report vanished. It had been tucked under Helen's pillow by a kind occupational therapist named Mike. When the night nurse came in to turn her, it was gone. Helen knew who took it before the sheets had settled. Melissa. She'd shown up that afternoon, all polished smiles and fake concern, and wheeled Helen into the courtyard for air, keeping Grace behind with a staff member to ask questions. A distraction, a window of time. Helen lay awake all night, seething. The next morning, Grace entered the room early, too early to be casual. She sat beside Helen's bed, reached under her hoodie, and pulled out a folded manila envelope. Slid it under the blanket and into Helen's trembling hand. I found it in Mom's purse, she whispered. Helen blinked once. Thank you. She waited until lights out to open it. Her fingers barely worked, but she managed. The report was there. Printed charts, strength gains, mobility milestones, written proof that she was improving. Not just surviving. She slid it into her rehab journal. A fake one she'd asked Janet to bring from the hospital gift shop, the kind of floral paperback no one would bother opening. Then she slid the journal into the drawer by her bed, under a pack of adult diapers and a cheap paperback novel with the title, the silent widow. And for the first time in over a week, she felt like herself again. Not dead, not forgotten, dangerous. The breakfast tray arrived late, again. Lukewarm oatmeal, a single slice of dry toast, a small plastic cup of orange juice. Helen ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on the woman in scrubs who entered behind it. Not a nurse, not familiar. The woman smiled like someone who had been briefed poorly. "Hi, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm Lori from Admin Services. Just following up on your file for the in-home caregiver benefits. You'll likely be approved for the stipend within a few weeks." Helen blinked once, slow. What file? Lori hesitated. "The application was submitted by your son, Ryan Caldwell. It lists him as your primary caregiver and— oh, wait." She flipped through the packet on her clipboard. "You authorized this by phone on the 6th? The 6th was the day after the stroke." Helen blinked again. Sharp now. "No." Lori frowned. "That's strange. The documentation said you were alert enough to consent. I'll double-check with the coordinator. It's probably just a clerical—" The door opened. Grace stepped in, backpack slung off one shoulder. She stopped mid-step, sensing the temperature shift. "What's going on?" she asked. Lori cleared her throat. "Just explaining the paperwork for your grandma's in-home care stipend. Ryan handled the filing." Helen's throat clenched, her fingers curling into the stiff sheet. Lied. He lied. Her signature wasn't anywhere. It couldn't be. "He never told us that," Grace said, guarded. "You said it was a phone authorization?" Lori nodded, already uncomfortable. "That's what the file states." Helen's heart hammered. She blinked twice. False. Fraud. After Lori left, Grace moved in close. "I'll ask him, right now." Helen made a low rasp, barely audible. "Why?" Grace hesitated. "He said you wouldn't understand it anyway." The silence that followed was blistering. Helen's chest rose and fell in tight, uneven breaths. Wouldn't understand? The same woman who managed the family budget for 30 years, who had worked as a county clerk for 12, who could recite her social security number, pension details, and property tax code from memory. She stared at the door. Her son, had taken her name and twisted it into a payday. After Grace left to find a staff printer, Helen called Janet over with her speech board. She dragged her fingers slowly, purposefully. Copy. Full form. Filed. Janet whistled low. "Damn, they're not even pretending anymore." Helen glanced toward the hallway, making sure no one lingered. Her voice came out as a hiss of gravel and grit. "That is fraud." Janet raised an eyebrow. "Well, you'd know. You were a records clerk, right?" Helen nodded. Janet leaned closer. "What's your next move, Dangerous?" Helen stared straight ahead, pulse steadying, anger carving a new clarity. Her fingers dragged across the speech board again. 3 letters. P-A-U. Janet frowned. "Paul?" Helen blinked. "Yes." Janet rubbed her chin. "You mean that elder law guy who got Mrs. Doolin her house back from her nephew last year? Henson?" Helen blinked twice. Janet nodded slowly, like the game was finally coming into focus. "Okay, I know a nurse who dated his receptionist. You want me to make the call?" Helen didn't blink this time, just stared, full of fire. 10 minutes later, Janet pulled the privacy curtain and dialed from her own phone, speaking in a voice that was surprisingly smooth and professional for someone who wore tie-dye socks and cussed like a sailor. "This is Janet Monroe over at Lakeside Rehab. I need to get a message to Paul Henson. Tell him it's regarding Helen Caldwell, and that it's urgent. Elder exploitation." Her consent was forged on a federal caregiver stipend. She hung up and gave Helen a look that was almost proud. "He's got a thing for these kinds of cases," Janet said. "Bet you $10 he shows up in under 48 hours. Helen blinked once. Janet grinned. Didn't think you'd take the bet? That night, as the halls went quiet and the hallway lights dimmed to a dusky gold, Grace snuck in again. This time with a copy of the full application front to back. Helen's name was signed in tight cursive near the bottom, a signature she hadn't written. She stared at the page long enough to memorize every letter, every loop forged in her name. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She simply whispered, dry, cracked, deliberate, "He's done." The manila envelope had barely cooled in Helen's hand before the next strike landed. This time it came dressed in legality. The rehab administrator, Mr. Keller, knocked gently, eyes full of the polite unease that always preceded bad news. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm afraid there's been a filing." Helen narrowed her eyes. "A petition for emergency guardianship," he continued, "filed by your children, Ryan and Melissa Caldwell." She blinked once. No surprise. But it still burned. "They're claiming cognitive decline, unsafe judgment, vulnerability to manipulation." He cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze. "There's a hearing scheduled in 4 days. Friday, 9 a.m. Family Court. Judge Lindell." Grace sat frozen on the vinyl couch near the window, her hands balled into fists. "They didn't even tell us." "They didn't have to," Keller said quietly. "Emergency petitions bypass the usual notice period. They cited your stroke and the recent move to assisted care." Helen didn't move, but her chest rose, slowly, measured. She'd learned to breathe past betrayal. Paul Henson arrived that evening in a blazer that looked slept in, and with the kind of focus that made nurses pause mid-step. He pulled a chair close to her bed and laid out a thin folder of court forms, legal codes, and a plan written in bullet points. "They're betting on inertia," he said, flipping a page. "They assume you'll either be too impaired to fight or too tired to try." Helen's voice came out hoarse but steady. "They're wrong." He smiled faintly. "Good. Because if we're going to contest this, we need documentation and fast. I want a formal neurological eval on file before Thursday. Memory, logic, executive function. We'll need it certified." Grace leaned in. "Can we really get all that in time?" Paul nodded. "I've already scheduled it. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. The evaluation took place in a sunlit testing room at Lakeside's annex building. No family. Just Helen, a cognitive specialist named Dr. Sims, and a clipboard that became the battlefield. Helen traced shapes, identified sequences, answered math problems in a whisper, recalled lists of words after 5-minute delays, wrote full sentences, then 2. Dr. Sims blinked at the second one. "That's excellent handwriting for someone post-stroke." Helen rasped. "I'm right-handed." "Not anymore," Sims muttered. He made a mark in the corner of the form. "You just spelled irreversible correctly, left-handed, in cursive." Helen smiled without showing her teeth. By evening, Paul had the results in hand, stamped, notarized, and sealed. "She scored in the 97th percentile for cognitive retention," he said, laying the report beside her tray table. "They're not going to like this." Helen's eyes glittered. But Paul wasn't finished. "Tomorrow, we introduce the recordings." Grace opened her phone and tapped the screen. A soft hum filled the room. Melissa's voice, sharp and scathing. "She's barely functional. This is a waiting game." Ryan's laughter. Melissa again. "She'll sign anything we put in front of her. Or we just say she did." Paul listened to each clip like a surgeon studying X-rays. This is textbook elder manipulation. They're laying the groundwork to seize her assets before she's even discharged. He looked at Helen. "We don't just fight the guardianship. We expose their intent." Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the courthouse windows fogged with drizzle. Helen was wheeled into the courtroom by Grace, her face composed, her hair brushed and pinned neatly. Janet had found her a navy blue cardigan that made her look dignified, not fragile. Melissa was already seated beside Ryan at the front bench, both in stiff, practiced sympathy. Helen watched Melissa freeze for just half a second when she entered. Paul stood as the judge entered. "Your Honor," he began, "before you consider the emergency guardianship petition, I'd like to submit documentation of the respondent's cognitive capacity, as well as evidence of manipulation by the petitioners." Judge Lindell, a stern woman with clipped bangs and a courtroom glare that could flatten drywall, raised an eyebrow. "Let's see it." The room was silent as Grace played the recordings. Ryan went rigid. Melissa flushed crimson. "She'll sign anything. Don't bother explaining it. She won't understand." Paul submitted the neuro-eval next. Dr. Sims's report concludes Mrs. Caldwell is mentally competent, lucid, and capable of independent decision-making. Judge Lindell flipped through the documents. Then she sat back. "I'm not issuing a guardianship order today," she said. "I'm placing a hold on the petition. A court-appointed investigator will conduct a full review, including interviews with staff, family, and the respondent. We reconvene in 2 weeks." Melissa stood abruptly. "But, Your Honor?" "Sit down, Miss Caldwell." Helen stared straight ahead. Composed, controlled. But in her lap, her good hand slowly curled into a fist. The rain hadn't stopped since the hearing. A cold, relentless drizzle that mirrored the mood in room 212 at Lakeside. But Helen didn't mind. She liked the sound. It was clean, constant, and it drowned out the noise of nerves chewing at her resolve. Paul arrived at 7:45 the next morning, dripping from the shoulders and carrying a file folder so thick it needed a binder clip. He didn't bother with small talk. "They tried to file a quitclaim deed behind your back," he said, dropping the folder onto her bedside tray. "Melissa submitted it yesterday afternoon, naming herself and Ryan as joint owners. No notarized signature from you, of course. Just a forged one again." Helen's hand trembled slightly on the edge of the tray. Another lie. Another theft. "But I got a judge to grant a temporary injunction on all title transfers tied to your property," Paul continued. "We'll get it formalized this week, but I need your originals. The title, tax records, any proof of ownership with your name. Can you get them?" Helen blinked once. Grace was already ahead of him. "I'll go. The filing cabinet in the hallway closet, top drawer. She keeps everything." 2 hours later, Grace returned with a plastic accordion folder crammed full of labeled tabs. Helen's handwriting, blocky, clean, certain, marked every divider. Mortgage, tax year 2021, title copy, will drafts. Paul flipped through it like a man skimming a battlefield map. This is perfect. Exactly what we need." That night, a rush hearing was granted. Helen insisted on being present, even if it meant being wheeled through slush and wind in a paratransit van. In the courtroom, Melissa sat with her arms folded, chin lifted like the defendant was somehow her. Ryan stayed silent, a nervous crease between his brows betraying more guilt than he probably realized. Paul stood again, steady and relentless. "Your Honor, I'm here today on behalf of Helen Caldwell, the rightful sole owner of the residential property at 312 Beechwood Lane. The opposing party has filed a fraudulent deed transfer without authorization or valid signature from the homeowner." He held up the folder. "This is the original title, dated and recorded in Mrs. Caldwell's name. These are her tax receipts. Filed, signed, paid in full. Every year without lapse. Her property. Her name. Not theirs." Melissa's voice sliced across the courtroom. "She can't even mow the lawn." Helen turned toward her. Unblinking. "I can hire someone. It's still mine." Gasps were audible. So was the way Melissa's face drained of color. Judge Lindell, already familiar from the guardianship hearing, looked over the papers with a narrowed gaze. Ms. Caldwell, you submitted a deed transfer without proof of consent or capacity. That borders on criminal fraud. Melissa opened her mouth. Ryan grabbed her wrist. Don't, he whispered. The judge looked back at Helen. Mrs. Caldwell, do you wish to retain ownership of this home? Helen's voice cracked, but it was strong. Yes, it's the last thing he built for me. She didn't say her husband's name. She didn't need to. The courtroom stilled with that kind of grief that doesn't beg for pity, only respect. Then I'm issuing a freeze, the judge said. All property actions relating to 312 Beechwood Lane are hereby suspended until the investigation is complete. No deed transfers, no sales, no liens. Violate it, and you'll be held in contempt. Melissa stood abruptly, face tight. You're going to let her rot in that house alone? With a broken body and a nurse? Just so she can clutch a pile of bricks until she dies? Helen met her eyes. Calm. Clear. Yes. Melissa sat back down without another word. Back in the van, headed toward Lakeside, the silence was thick. Until Janet, who'd insisted on tagging along as moral support, reached over and patted Helen's knee. First victory, she said. Don't get soft on us now. Helen didn't reply. She was too focused on the next fight. Because this wasn't about nostalgia. This was about taking back every single thing they'd tried to strip from her, starting with her name, her voice, and the roof they thought they could steal while she was too weak to speak. The first time Helen stood upright without assistance, it lasted 6 seconds. Janet counted them aloud like a coach at a boxing ring. 1, 2. Don't wobble on me, Caldwell. 4, 5. Hell yes. Helen collapsed back into the chair, chest heaving, sweat prickling her brow. She didn't smile, but she gave Janet the faintest nod. Every step is proof, Janet said, pulling the gate belt free. Not just to the therapists, to the ones trying to bury you. Helen didn't need to be reminded. Every shuffle down the parallel bars, every grip of a handweight, every lunch tray she reached for without help, it was all evidence. That she was present, that she remembered, that she was dangerous again. Melissa arrived the next day wearing perfume too sharp for a rehab wing and carrying a pink folder. Helen saw it before she even spoke. I brought something that could really take the pressure off, Melissa said, folding herself into the visitor's chair like she was the hero of this story. A power of attorney form, financial and medical, just temporary. While you focus on healing. Helen said nothing, just stared. Melissa sighed. Look, it's not about control. You've got so much on your plate. These hearings, the rehab, your meds. How are you supposed to manage any of that without help? She leaned in slightly. Ryan and I are just trying to protect what you built. But if you keep treating us like the enemy, you're going to burn bridges that don't need burning. Helen slowly reached for her notepad with her left hand, wrote one word in tight block letters. No. Melissa's jaw flexed. You don't even want to read it? Helen added 2 more words underneath. Already did. Melissa's tone dropped, cool and edged. Then you understand what you're choosing. You're gambling everything on a stack of sympathy and a halfway recovery. Helen picked up her phone and tapped open the voice recorder app. She didn't say anything. She just let it run. Melissa noticed and laughed dryly. Oh, please. You think playing gotcha's going to change reality? Helen tapped the stop button, labeled it with the date, then stared until Melissa stood and walked out, heels clacking like accusations. That night, Grace came in after dinner, her backpack slung over one shoulder, looking pale and tight-jawed. They're circling, she said quietly, closing the door behind her. Melissa's been calling my phone nonstop, offering money, telling me I need to be realistic. She said, they're just waiting for you to forget something. Anything, Helen raised her brows. Miss a signature, skip a dose, confuse a name. Something they can use in court to prove you're slipping. Helen slowly reached for her bedside drawer. Inside, a small spiral notebook. She flipped it open and showed Grace the inside. Every conversation, every visit, every strange question. Logged, dated, documented. Grace let out a shaky breath. You're 3 moves ahead of them, Helen whispered. They're betting. I'll blink. Grace nodded. Then don't. The next morning, Paul arrived with news. They're trying again, he said without preamble. Melissa sent a complaint to the investigator claiming your memory's declining. She cited a missed call with your primary doctor as proof of medical confusion. It's a stall tactic, trying to slow the ruling until they can claim diminished capacity. Helen's face didn't move, but her grip tightened on the therapy rail. So, Paul continued, I'm bringing in a second evaluator, independent of the rehab, the court, everyone. A geriatric neuropsychologist, old colleague of mine. She'll assess memory, reasoning, judgment. All the little cracks they're praying will show. He paused. If you're up for it. Helen's voice came out like steel under dust. I want it. That night, Janet helped her into bed slowly, carefully. They're going to keep pushing, you know, she said. They don't need you to lose everything. They just need you to slip. Once. Helen turned her head. Then I won't. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped. But Helen knew storms didn't always announce themselves. Sometimes they wore perfume and smiled while handing you poison. The second evaluation had gone well, better than expected. Helen remembered every word Dr. Abramson tested her with, twice. Her reflexes were slow, but steady. Her recall? Sharp as glass. But something in her gut told her it wouldn't be enough. Not to end this. Melissa hadn't shown up in 4 days. That made Helen nervous. She didn't trust the quiet, not from someone like her daughter. It was Grace who uncovered it, the way she always did. Quietly, and by accident. She'd come to drop off a new refill of Helen's blood pressure medication. The nurse handed her the blister pack and explained the dosage schedule. Grace smiled, nodded, and took it straight to Helen's bedside. She never brought you this, did she? Grace asked softly. Helen blinked once. No. That med had been missing for 2 days. The nurse had said it must have been delayed. Back-ordered. Grace's eyes narrowed. I think I saw it. She stepped back toward the door, then turned and whispered. When Mom visited 2 nights ago, she left her purse on the chair. It fell over when she got up to leave. I saw the edge of a prescription pack tucked under her wallet. Thought it was weird at the time. Helen's stomach twisted. She took them. She took them on purpose. 30 minutes later, Grace returned with the purse. She left it in the car, she said, breathless. I didn't steal it. I just borrowed it long enough to check. She unzipped the side pocket slowly, reverently, and pulled it out. Helen's prescription. Still sealed, still full, dated 4 days ago. I knew it, Grace whispered. She's trying to set you up. Helen closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to steady the rage. Then she reached for the call button. The nurse who arrived, young, ponytailed, sweet-voiced, didn't know the war she was walking into. I've lost my pills, Helen rasped. The nurse looked surprised. You're missing a dose. Helen shook her head, pointed at the chart on her tray table, then the prescription in Grace's hand. The nurse's eyes widened. You never received this? Are you saying this was withheld? Helen blinked twice. Yes. The nurse hesitated. I'll have to file a med discrepancy report. That gets logged officially with your attending physician and the administrator. Helen wrote on her notepad in sharp print. Please do. 2 hours later, the report was entered into the digital system. Helen requested a paper copy. She slid it into her black binder, the one that lived beneath her bed. Next to the audio logs, the court filings, the guardianship delay ruling, the deed freeze. By the time Paul arrived that evening, she already had the pages labeled and clipped. When he saw it, he didn't smile. He looked angry. The quiet kind. "She kept your medication from you?" he asked, voice tight. Helen nodded. "That's not just unethical. That's neglect. Weaponized neglect. Intentional interference with medical care." Paul glanced at Grace. "If you hadn't found it..." Grace looked sick. She could have had a stroke. Or worse. Paul turned back to Helen. "We're adding this to the packet. Judge Lindell needs to see it. With the nurse's log." Helen's hand hovered over her spiral notebook. She didn't say it, but Paul read it in her eyes. One more piece. One more nail. Janet walked in mid-conversation, a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand, licorice in the other. She scanned the scene and nodded at the binder. "What did I miss?" Paul filled her in. When he finished, Janet gave a low whistle. "You've got them cornered, Caldwell. One more mistake and they're gonna fold like wet cardboard." Helen didn't respond right away. She flipped to the back of the binder and added a post-it note. Neglect. Feb 11. BP meds withheld by Melissa. She closed it. Slow and sure. That night, as rain started again, soft and rhythmic against the window, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "You don't have to keep fighting alone, you know." Helen looked at her. "I'm not," she said softly. But inside she knew the truth. The next move wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would come from desperation, because Melissa had run out of lies, and that meant she was about to do something reckless. They didn't arrive in suits. They came in sensible shoes and state-issued lanyards. One carried a plain leather portfolio, the other a tablet already logged into a state health and protective services portal. Both wore the flat, cautious expressions of people who'd seen too many families implode behind closed doors. "Mrs. Caldwell," said the taller one, a woman in her 40s with a clipped tone and the badge to match. "We're with Adult Protective Services, Elder Division. We're conducting a formal inquiry into a report of potential financial abuse and medical neglect. We'd like to speak with you privately." Helen didn't hesitate. Grace stood, clutching her phone, and nodded at Helen before stepping out. The investigators shut the door behind her and pulled 2 chairs close to the bed. The second one, a younger man, opened the file. "We've reviewed the initial court transcripts, the guardianship filings, and the med discrepancy report. But we're told you've kept documentation of your own?" Helen reached beneath the bed, pulled the binder into her lap with her left hand. She didn't hand it over. She opened it. First tab. Timeline. Second. Forged signatures. Third. Medical records evaluations 1 and 2. Fourth. Audio transcripts. She turned each page deliberately, stopping only when she reached the last divider. Neglect. Feb 11. Then she pointed to the post-it, handwritten in bold black marker. BP meds withheld by Melissa. The woman raised an eyebrow. "You logged everything?" Helen rasped. "They counted on silence." She pulled out the voice recorder and placed it on the tray table. Hit play. Melissa's voice poured into the quiet. "She won't even notice if we skip one dose. It's not like she's reading the bottles anymore." Helen hit stop. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then a knock. Grace re-entered without being asked, her face pale but her hand steady as she walked over to Helen and held out her phone. "I backed everything up to the cloud," she said. "But you should hear the originals." She tapped a folder marked Mom and Ryan, uncut, and handed the device to the investigator. The younger man slipped in headphones and hit play. His expression didn't move, but the fingers holding the tablet went rigid. Meanwhile, the woman leaned toward Helen. Have Melissa Caldwell or Ryan Caldwell ever had medical power of attorney, financial control, or guardianship over you at any point? Helen blinked once. No. Have you ever consented to a transfer of property, funds, or medical decisions to either party? Helen shook her head, then pointed to the forged signature samples in the binder. Outside, the door opened. Loud this time. Melissa's voice filtered in, high-pitched, agitated. This is absolutely ridiculous. She's been confused for months. She forgets her own birthday. She still thinks she's in her old house. She mixes up the names of her nurses. The door opened. Melissa stepped inside without knocking, Ryan close behind her. His face was flushed, lips pressed tight. I'm sorry, the investigator said, standing. We're conducting a confidential interview. You weren't invited. She's manipulating all of you, Melissa snapped. She's always been controlling. She's just angry we finally stood up to her. Ryan spoke for the first time. She's confused. I'm telling you, she's making this all up. I've seen her. She forgets what day it is, repeats questions. The younger investigator took off his headphones. Calmly. That's interesting, he said, because I just listened to a full, uninterrupted audio file from February 8th. Helen Caldwell identifies herself, details the dosage and timing of her medication, and asks Melissa directly why it wasn't administered. Melissa paled. Ryan started to speak again, but the woman raised a hand. Mr. Caldwell, Ms. Caldwell, she said. This interview is not your forum. You'll have your own. Melissa opened her mouth, closed it again. The woman turned back to Helen. Do you have any other recordings or materials to submit? Helen flipped to the very last page of the binder, a photocopy of her handwritten note to the attending nurse the day the pills went missing. The investigator smiled faintly, not kindly, but the way a surgeon might when realizing a tumor had clear, visible edges. Thank you, she said. You've been more prepared than most. She stood, nodded to Grace, and said, You'll receive a follow-up in 5 to 7 days. But this is more than enough to initiate formal review. As the investigators left, Grace closed the door behind them, slow and careful. Melissa and Ryan lingered in the hallway, voices low but sharp. Helen couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She'd just flipped the board. Now it was check or be checked. The courtroom was already packed when they wheeled Helen inside. Medical aides in scrubs lined the back row, shifting uncomfortably. A few of them had worked her night shifts. Some had whispered support. Others had looked away. But they were all here now. Paul walked beside her, binder in hand. Grace followed with a tote full of labeled exhibits. Janet was there too, leaning against the wall near the aisle, licorice in one hand, glaring like she dared anyone to make Helen feel small. Helen kept her eyes straight ahead. Judge Lindell sat elevated in her robe, stone-faced and exacting. Her gavel rested like a loaded pistol. The court clerk called the case. In RE, Helen Caldwell. Petition for guardianship and revocation of existing elder care financial stipends. Ryan was already seated at the petitioner's table, tie askew. Melissa stood behind him, arms crossed, trying to look composed. She didn't. Paul rose. Your Honor, the court has already seen early documentation, forged filings, an attempted unauthorized deed transfer, and withheld medical treatment. Today, we offer final evidence and testimony. He turned slightly toward Helen. With the court's permission, I'd like to begin with the respondent's independent documentation. Proceed, Lindell said. Paul opened the binder like it was a loaded weapon. We've included notarized title documents, medical evaluation from Dr. Sims, and follow-up from Dr. Abramson confirming full cognitive capacity, a nurse's report detailing withheld blood pressure medication, and 5 voice recordings confirming manipulation, neglect, and strategic deception by both petitioners. He handed copies to the clerk, who passed them to the bench. Additionally, Paul continued, we have testimony from Grace Caldwell, granddaughter of the respondent and direct witness to multiple events under question. Grace stood, took her oath, and approached the front. Her voice didn't shake. I saw everything, she said, eyes locked on Melissa. I saw the pills in her purse. I heard them talking through how to stage confusion. I recorded it. I brought the recordings to my grandmother. She wasn't confused. She was trapped. Melissa let out a dry laugh. You're 20. You think you understand estate law? You don't even know how your student loans work. Ms. Caldwell, Lindell said sharply, this is not your turn. Paul nodded toward the back of the room. For the record, Your Honor, we also have a copy of the full APS investigator's summary. The conclusion recommends against any form of guardianship and outlines an active case of suspected elder exploitation. Judge Lindell glanced at the folder before her, flipping pages with surgical efficiency. Silence rippled through the room. Then Melissa did what Paul had quietly hoped she would. She cracked. Your Honor, she won't even last another year, Melissa blurted, her voice too loud, too fast. We're the ones who'll have to manage her care, sort her finances, clean out the house when she... A gasp swept the courtroom. Helen didn't flinch. She'd seen the look in Melissa's eyes before. It wasn't grief. It was expectation. Judge Lindell looked up slowly. You just admitted motive for financial control, she said coldly. Melissa opened her mouth, shut it. Ryan slid away from her like she was leaking radiation. Lindell adjusted her glasses. This court finds no valid grounds for guardianship. The respondent is mentally competent, physically improving, and demonstrably able to direct her care. She paused, voice tightening. The elder care stipend submitted under forged consent is hereby revoked. All funds are to be returned within 60 days. An investigation into misuse of federal benefits is now referred to the State Attorney General's office. Melissa swayed slightly. Ryan stared down at the floor, jaw clenched. Furthermore, the judge continued, any attempt to petition this court again on behalf of Helen Caldwell without independent medical findings and third-party legal representation will be considered harassment. Paul folded his hands neatly. Thank you, Your Honor. The gavel dropped. Helen breathed. Not relief. Just oxygen that no longer tasted like fear. Grace leaned down beside her, whispering through tears. You did it. But Helen shook her head once. No, she whispered. We did. Behind them, Melissa pushed out of the courtroom, shoving past the crowd. But before the door closed behind her, Helen caught her eyes one last time. And for the first time since this began, Melissa looked scared. The county title office was quiet, lined with gray carpet and walls painted the color of old printer paper. No lines. No waiting. Just the weight of finality wrapped in fluorescent lighting. Helen sat upright in her wheelchair, her black binder resting in her lap like armor. Paul stood beside her in a crisp navy suit that had started to wrinkle at the cuffs. Grace flanked her other side, holding a worn leather folder and biting the inside of her cheek. Across the counter, a clerk with cherry-red glasses clicked through the screen. She tapped the keyboard with the calm of someone who'd seen 100 family betrayals, none of them surprising anymore. Confirmed, the woman said finally. You're the sole deed holder. Title's clean. No active disputes, no power of attorney notations, and no transfer attempts listed as valid. Property is yours, Mrs. Caldwell. And only yours. Helen didn't blink, but Paul smiled faintly. We'd like to file a trust document now, he said. She's ready to make it permanent. Of course, the clerk said, already standing to grab the second file. Room 3 is open for the trust intake. I'll have a notary meet you there. They wheeled Helen down a short hallway and into a glass-walled conference room. The trust packet was waiting, 60 pages thick, the edges flagged with color-coded tabs. The receptionist reappeared moments later with a notary stamp and a practiced smile. Paul laid out the first page. "All you need is a signature at each tab, Helen. We filled everything in." Helen took the pen in her left hand, still a little stiff, but steadier than last week, and began. Signature, tab. Each stroke was deliberate, no matter how slow. Her hand trembled near the end, but she didn't stop. It wasn't just about sealing her name on paper. It was about making it untouchable. They reached the final section. Grace leaned over the table, reading aloud softly. Trust beneficiaries, Grace Caldwell. Successor trustee, Paul Henson. Revocation rights, solely Helen J. Caldwell. Excluded individuals, Ryan Caldwell, Melissa Caldwell. She paused and looked up. Helen didn't speak. She just signed. Hard enough that the ink bled through to the copy beneath. The notary pressed her seal onto the document with a thick click of finality. The last tab was removed. Paul gathered the pages and placed the original into a protective folder with the county seal on the front. Helen stared at it, then touched the folder with her fingertips. That was her name. Still hers. And now legally out of reach. Back outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. The wind had softened. No more February sting. Just that crisp bite of transition. Winter losing its grip. Spring not yet arrived. Grace leaned down beside the wheelchair. They can't touch you now, Grandma. They can't change anything anymore. Helen's voice was dry but firm. They never could. Not really. Janet leaned against the waiting van, sipping from a paper cup and waving the group over. She eyed the envelope tucked beneath Helen's arm. "Let me guess," she said. "Filed, stamped, sealed, and ironclad?" Paul grinned. "She just signed the estate into a living trust. No probate, no access, and no loopholes." Janet chuckled. "Sharp as ever." Inside the van, as they pulled away from the government building and headed back toward Lakeside, Helen sat with her hands resting on the sealed folder like it was a map of her future. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. About keeping the name she'd built alongside her late husband. About ensuring that when the world looked at her legacy, it would not be rewritten by the children who'd tried to erase her while she still drew breath. Paul glanced back from the passenger seat. "You did good today." Helen met his eyes. "We did good." Still, beneath the steady satisfaction in her chest, she felt something coiled and waiting. Melissa hadn't called. Ryan hadn't shown up. Silence could mean surrender. But silence from Melissa Caldwell? More likely, it meant something was coming. The call came on a Saturday morning, just after breakfast trays had been cleared. Janet answered Helen's room phone without asking. "Room 212, Monroe speaking. You waking us up better be worth it." A pause. Then her face changed. She held the receiver out toward Helen. "It's your neighbor. From Beechwood." Helen blinked once. Grace leaned over and pressed speakerphone. "Mrs. Caldwell." The voice crackled, slightly winded. "It's Maureen from across the street. I don't know if I should have called the police first, but I thought you should know." "Tell me," Helen rasped. "I saw your daughter, Melissa, in front of your mailbox, yesterday afternoon. She was pulling out your mail like she owned the place." Helen's breath caught. She parked around the corner, like she was hiding. I didn't realize it was her at first, but then she looked up and she saw me. She got in her car and drove off. Janet didn't speak. Just looked at Grace. Grace was already pulling out her phone. "She's never had a key," she muttered. "Not even when Grandpa was alive. There's no legal reason for her to be there." Maureen's voice came again. "I thought maybe she was forwarding things for you. But when I walked over later, I found an envelope in the gutter. Medicare notice. Opened." I recognize the logo. Helen felt the rage burn slow and steady this time. Not like a spark. Like an ember placed deliberately on dry wood. Paul arrived less than an hour later. "You did the right thing," he said after hearing the full story. "We'll need a formal statement from Maureen. Grace. Get her to write down everything. Date, time, what she saw, what was taken." He turned to Helen. "Tampering with federal mail? That's a felony. She just crossed into criminal territory." Helen reached for her notepad. "File police report. Today." By the end of the day, it was done. Officer Harding from the local PD arrived at Lakeside, asked a handful of questions, and took the Medicare envelope as evidence. He said he'd follow up with the postal inspector's office on Monday. "You're not the first," he said with a sigh. "Happens more than folks think. Family thinks they're entitled. They're not." Helen nodded once, but she was already thinking 10 steps ahead. That night, Grace arrived with a small metal lockbox tucked under her coat. "I picked it up at the hardware store. Dad still has a copy of your front door key, so I changed the mailbox lock too. I left you one key and the mail carrier gets the second." She handed Helen the box. It was nothing fancy. Steel gray. Small. Sturdy. Helen ran her fingers across the top, then slowly opened the lid. Inside were her latest letters, new insurance statements, the court's guardianship ruling, and the county notice confirming her trust was filed. Proof. All of it. She closed the box and turned the key. The click was sharp and satisfying. "She won't stop," Grace whispered. "I thought she would. But after everything, court, APS, the trust, she still won't stop." Janet leaned in from the armchair where she was knitting what looked like a scarf for a vengeful outlaw. "Then you don't stop either," she said. "You finish what you started." Helen looked down at the box in her lap. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like something sacred. Not just protection. Ownership. Everything in that box was a record of what Melissa had tried to steal. Everything she'd failed to take. But now Melissa had changed tactics. She wasn't challenging the law anymore. She was slipping around it, stealing in daylight, banking on silence. Helen looked at Grace. "Camera." Grace blinked. "You want one installed?" Helen nodded. "Motion sensor, battery backup, front yard." Grace smiled for the first time all day. "Okay, I'll handle it." Helen leaned back, staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open. Melissa was digging herself deeper. And Helen? She wasn't just watching anymore. She was building a case. The knock at Melissa's door came at 7:58 a.m. She answered in a satin robe, coffee in hand, assuming it was a package delivery. Instead, it was two officers in dark uniforms and state-issued vests, standing shoulder to shoulder like a wall. "Melissa Caldwell?" one of them asked. She nodded slowly. "You're under arrest for tampering with federal mail, theft of protected correspondence, and obstruction of an active elder abuse investigation. Step outside, please." She blinked, stunned. There must be a mistake. But the cuffs were already clicking behind her back. Inside the house, Ryan appeared in the hallway, still in his undershirt. "Wait, what the hell is going on?" "Sir, stay back," the officer said. "This doesn't concern you yet." Neighbors watched from porches and behind blinds. By the time Melissa was guided into the back of the cruiser, a Ring doorbell 2 houses down had already uploaded the footage. Within the hour, it was circulating group texts, neighborhood Facebook pages, and someone's Instagram story under the caption, "Wanek Mail Fraud Mom." Back at Lakeside, Helen watched the video from Grace's phone, her face unreadable. Janet, sitting on the windowsill, let out a slow whistle. "Red robe, morning hair, zero shame," she muttered. "That's not a perp walk, that's a parade float." Grace scrolled through comments with her jaw set. "It's spreading fast." Someone from school messaged me. A screenshot already hit a community Reddit page. Helen leaned back in her chair. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. But her fingers tapped slowly across the armrest, a silent rhythm of consequence long overdue. At his office downtown, Ryan wasn't faring better. By 11 a.m., HR had pulled him from a conference call and asked him to step into a quick meeting. By noon, he was sitting across from two senior partners who didn't bother offering him coffee. The allegations were concerning. The optics were untenable. The legal department would be conducting an internal review into any firm resources used during the contested guardianship proceedings. He was placed on unpaid leave. By 2, Ryan was walking out with a cardboard box full of office supplies and a single email address to direct all further inquiries. Paul arrived at Lakeside later that afternoon, his tone crisp and matter-of-fact. "She made bail," he said, setting his briefcase on the table. But the judge restricted her travel, imposed a no-contact order, and approved access to the USPS's internal investigation file, and Ryan's been suspended from work. PR's already distancing the firm? Helen raised her eyebrows slightly, not with surprise, just confirmation. Grace sat on the couch near the window, arms crossed. How long until they realize no one's coming to save them? Paul exhaled. We're there. He turned to Helen. We call this the unraveling stage. They overplayed, reached too far. Now it's just one thread pulling loose after another. Janet leaned forward, voice low. They're spiraling. Grace nodded. She told me once, when I was little, that some people don't get scared when they lose power. They get reckless. Helen didn't speak for a long moment. Her eyes were on the rain-streaked window, light filtering through like a memory she didn't want back. Then she reached for the black lockbox at her side, opened it, and pulled out a single document. Paul's eyes narrowed. Is that? She nodded. A draft civil complaint, defamation, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, financial damages. Paul sat down across from her slowly, reading the header. You're sure? Helen's voice was quiet but razor-sharp. I'm not here to watch them squirm. She met his eyes. I'm here to finish this. He nodded once, then again, slower. We'll file it first thing Monday. Janet raised her coffee cup in mock salute. To the Caldwell comeback. But Grace didn't smile. Not yet. Because she could feel what Helen already knew. The worst part of justice wasn't the paperwork. It was what came after it hit. The pen was heavier than Helen remembered. Not physically, just in consequence. Paul laid the final documents out on the tray table beside her bed. His tone was calm, but beneath it was the same weight she felt. The gravity of permanence. Everything's here, he said, flipping to the summary page. The irrevocable trust is official once you sign. No revisions, no reversals. It protects the estate from future claims and blocks Ryan and Melissa from contesting it. Forever. Helen nodded once, eyes steady. Paul continued. Primary beneficiary, Grace Caldwell. Co-beneficiary, Jefferson County Public Library Foundation, to fund youth literacy programs under your name. Helen's lips lifted, just slightly. They'll build a reading nook, she rasped, for kids who get left behind. Paul smiled. That's in the language, a physical space, books, seating, your name on the plaque. He slid the pen toward her. Whenever you're ready. Helen took the pen in her left hand. No tremble this time. The stroke was slow, but solid. Signature, date, another page, then another. Each time she signed, a little more air seemed to return to the room. As if, with each mark, she pushed Melissa's shadow further from the door. When she reached the last page, she looked up. Across the room, Grace sat still, clutching the leather folder with the deed copies and medical evaluations inside. Her eyes were glassy but bright. "You okay?" Helen asked softly. Grace nodded quickly. "Yeah. Just, I didn't think it'd feel like this." Helen tilted her head. "Like what?" Grace swallowed. "Like it's real. Like they can't undo it anymore." Paul stepped aside, giving space as the notary approached. She wasn't from the courthouse this time. She was Joanne, the weekend administrator at Lakeside, a woman who'd once taught adult GED courses and had taken Helen's vitals every Thursday for weeks. "I'm honored to witness this," Joanne said, her voice thick. "You're the most composed woman I've ever seen take back what was hers." Helen signed the final line. Joanne sealed it. Click, stamp, done. Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "So, it's over?" she asked Paul. "It's protected," he confirmed. "The trust goes into effect today. The house, the accounts, the insurance, all locked. Grace, you're the trustee and sole living heir. The Library Foundation receives its allocation automatically. If Ryan or Melissa ever file anything in probate court, we'll have grounds to sue for harassment and damages." He turned to Helen, more quietly now. "They're not just out of the will. They're legally erased from your estate. By your hand. By your choice." Helen didn't smile, but she closed her eyes for a moment. Not in exhaustion, in peace. Back in her room later, the trust folder lay open on the bed. Grace sat beside it, tracing the embossed seal with her fingertips. She didn't speak right away. Then she whispered, "You saved it. Everything." Helen turned toward her. "So it wouldn't be wasted." A pause. Then Grace added, "They can't touch anything now." Helen's voice was soft but unyielding. "They never should have been able to." Janet entered, holding 2 cups of tea and a third full of ice chips. "So," she said, plopping into the chair by the window. "Our girl Grace is official, huh? Sole heir to the Caldwell legacy?" Grace flushed. "It's not about the money." Janet raised an eyebrow. "Damn right it isn't. It's about truth, about choosing who carries your name and who doesn't." She clinked her cup against Helen's. "To irreversible moves and women who don't flinch." Helen sipped the ice water, her grip firm on the straw. Outside, dusk settled in, a slow lavender hue across the trees. Somewhere down the hallway, a nurse changed the sheets for the next shift. Voices murmured. Life continued. But inside that room, something else was beginning. Not an ending. Not revenge. Legacy. Helen turned to Grace, voice gravel and clarity in equal measure. "Next week," she said, "we go to the library. You help me draft the letter. They'll need a name for the space." Grace blinked. "What should we call it?" Helen didn't hesitate. "The Quiet Corner. A place for the unheard, a place for the overlooked, and the one place Melissa Caldwell would never, ever reach." The article dropped on a Thursday morning. Headline: "She fought her own children and won." It ran in the Jefferson Chronicle, the Sunday paper's digital arm, known mostly for city council updates and church bake sale ads. But this one hit different. Front page, 2 columns. Full-color photo of Helen Caldwell in her wheelchair, seated in front of the Jefferson Public Library's new plaque in progress, The Quiet Corner, in honor of Helen and Frank Caldwell. By noon, the article had been shared over 1,000 times. By 3 p.m., it hit local Reddit. By 5, it had reached the inboxes of everyone in Ryan's law office and half the Facebook friend list Melissa used to curate like a resume. The piece detailed everything: the forged signatures, the fake power of attorney attempts, the elder guardianship petition, the audio recordings, the withheld medication, and, most damning of all, the mail theft arrest. Neighbors read it. Teachers read it. Parents from Grace's college orientation group messaged her privately. "Is that your grandmother? She's amazing." Old classmates sent clapping emojis. One wrote, "Tell her she's a damn inspiration." The fallout was instant. At the Caldwell siblings' childhood church, Pastor Monroe delivered an entire sermon on the quiet sins of pride and control. Several heads turned toward the back pew, the one Melissa had always reserved with a handbag. It was empty. The doorbell at Ryan's apartment rang less and less. Amazon deliveries dwindled. The HOA president who used to wave at his car now crossed the sidewalk instead. Melissa had taken to grocery shopping 2 towns over. Once, she bumped into Maureen from Beechwood. The older woman didn't even flinch, just stared at her in cold silence until Melissa turned around and left her cart behind. Back at Lakeside, Helen sat beside the window, the article printed and folded on her lap. Grace stood behind her, phone in hand, glowing with the kind of pride usually reserved for medals and graduations. "You won," she whispered. Helen didn't answer right away. Her gaze was on the wind stirring the trees just beyond the glass. Then she said softly, "No one wins in a story like this." Grace frowned. "But they lost." Finally, Helen turned her head. "Yes, they did." Janet entered with a tray, lemon tea, toast, and a new crossword. "I brought the essentials," she said, then spotted the folded newspaper and grinned. "Did you see the comment section? Some guy named HawkDad82 called Melissa a thrift store Lady Macbeth." "I haven't laughed that hard in weeks." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" Janet shrugged. "Depends which thrift store." They all chuckled. Even Helen. Grace sat down beside her and reached for her hand. "You walked out stronger," she said. "Not just alive. Stronger." Helen's eyes didn't leave the window. She watched a boy walk by outside with a backpack bouncing off his shoulders, earbuds in, head tilted to the sun. "They counted me out," she said finally. "But I multiplied." Janet tilted her head. "Math metaphor. I like it." "No," Helen said, voice clear now. "It's not just math." She looked down at the article again, at her name in print. Not as a patient. Not as a victim. As the headline. "They tried to erase me, replace me, make decisions for me, but every time they came for something, I made more of it." She looked at Grace. "They came for my voice, so I spoke louder. They came for my house, so I made it my legacy. They came for my story, so I made it news." Grace nodded, tears barely held back. "You multiplied," she echoed. That night, Paul sent a text to Janet's phone with a screenshot. State's attorney filed motion to open civil investigation into Melissa's financials. Discovery begins next month. Janet showed it to Helen over tea. Helen smiled slowly. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about writing the ending. In ink Melissa could never wash away. The framed deed arrived in a slim, unmarked envelope. Grace unwrapped it carefully in the living room, sliding it from layers of recycled paper and bubble wrap like it was glass. She held it up to the afternoon light, her breath catching. Helen sat quietly in her armchair by the fireplace, not the one she used to rock in, but a new one Grace had chosen. Wider base, better support, still soft. "Here," Grace said, turning the frame around. "You should hang it." Helen rose slowly, cane in one hand, the other gripping Grace's elbow. She walked 3 steady steps to the wall above the old writing desk, the one her husband had built the year after they bought the place. They hung the deed there. Gold frame, cream matte, black ink against copy paper that held more weight than steel. Grace stepped back, head tilted. "Yours," she said. "Always." Helen didn't smile, not quite, but her hand reached up, resting gently on the bottom edge of the frame. Janet showed up around 11 with 2 large coffees and a bag of lemon scones. She let herself in without knocking, same as always, and called out toward the hallway. If you're not dressed, I'm drinking both of these. Helen appeared in the doorway, in clean slacks and a cardigan, slower but strong. Her hair was brushed back, her face bare, unbothered. You bring the crossword? She asked. Please, Janet said, holding up the paper. And the scandal section, you're in it again. Helen chuckled. Let them read. They sat in the sunlit kitchen, familiar and changed. The fruit bowl was full. The fridge finally had what Helen wanted inside it, not what someone else thought she should eat. The sound of the dishwasher hummed softly in the background. Janet raised her cup. To keeping what's yours. Helen clinked her mug against it. To knowing the difference. Paul arrived around 2 p.m., briefcase in hand, folder already open before he reached the door. He didn't need directions. He walked straight to the kitchen table, set the folder down gently in front of Helen, and tapped the top page. Final certified copy, he said. Original held in escrow, filed, recorded, and sealed. The trust stands. No one can touch it, not even me. Helen opened the folder and read the first line. The Helen J. Caldwell Living Trust, irrevocable. Her name, her choice, her house. She closed the folder and looked up at him. You did good. Paul smiled. You did better. He didn't stay long, just long enough to answer a few questions, sip half a cup of coffee, and make a quiet exit through the side door with a look of respect that needed no words. Later, when the house was quiet again, Helen stood slowly and began to walk, room by room. First, the kitchen. She ran a hand across the counter, remembering every birthday cake she'd made there, and the night Melissa had tried to pry open her freezer and find expired casseroles. Then the dining room, the oak table still scarred in the spot where Grace had spilled glitter glue as a child. That stain had always made Melissa twitch. Then the hallway, lined now with updated photos. Grace in her graduation gown, Helen next to the library plaque, no pictures of Ryan, none of Melissa. And finally, the master bedroom. The walls were freshly painted soft sage green. Her late husband's hat still hung on the hook by the closet, untouched. She reached out, let her fingers trace the brim. She stood there for a moment, not to grieve, just to remember. Then she said, low and clear, to no one at all. They woke me up arguing over my house. Her hand dropped to her side. She turned, made her way back to the living room, where the framed deed caught the last rays of the sun. They'll never step inside again. That night, Grace tucked the blanket over Helen's lap and picked up her cup of tea. I've been thinking, she said, about writing something down. Your whole story. Not just the part in the Chronicle. All of it. Helen's eyes glinted. Do it, she said. Make sure they learn what a whisper can do. Grace smiled. You'd want your name on it? Helen turned toward the window where the lights of Beechwood Lane twinkled faintly. No, she said. Just the first line. Grace tilted her head. What line? Helen's voice was even, crisp, final. After my stroke, I woke up to my son and daughter-in-law arguing over who gets the house, but I kept it and left them with nothing. And in the hush that followed, the house held still, not just hers in name, but in spirit. Every room intact, every memory protected, every door closed behind her, for good.